Hello, I'm here to ask you a favour before we begin this episode. I would really appreciate it if you could vote for Real Life Ghost Stories in the British Podcast Awards. Just go to britishpodcastawards.com/voting to cast your vote. You can vote once per email address and you have to verify your vote via email for it to count. It genuinely takes 30 seconds and you can vote from anywhere in the world. Am I likely to win? No. But do I enjoy turning a look at an event? Yes. And on a genuine note, it is such good free advertising for the podcast to have the name up there. So if you've enjoyed the podcast, if I've kept you company on a long journey, if I lull you to sleep at night with my dulcet tones, I would really appreciate if you could cast a little vote for Real Life Ghost Stories. And also, please do vote for any other indie podcasts that you listen to. The place to vote is britishpodcastawards.com/voting.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hello and welcome to mini episode 381 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And I have 3 spooky stories for you today, and the last story comes from the 25th of July 2024. And story number 1 comes from Charmane. My ghost story takes place in Seattle, Washington, circa 2005, with my younger brother, aunt, 2 cousins and my dog. I've had some experiences with unexplainable occurrences, but not like this one, and I haven't since. We were all around the same age, the youngest being about 8 and the eldest about 13. My brother, my aunt and I lived some blocks from an abandoned elementary school that we would always walk to so we could play in the playground and small connecting baseball field. It always gave me this creepy vibe, I think from just being abandoned. Also, looking into the windows, the classes were still full of desks, art on the walls and other classroom supplies. It also seemed so quiet when we were there, almost like it was soundproofed, even though we were outside surrounded by homes and a pretty busy street. I'm not sure when it was or how long it had been abandoned. This time, we walked with our cousins that were over visiting. It was just a normal summer day. We got to the school and started running around and playing, let the dog off the leash, and she ran around the playground and field too. The entire playground was wrapped in fence, maybe about 4 feet tall. And where the baseball diamond was, the fence reached 10 plus feet tall. After a while of playing, we settled on the jungle gym just laughing and talking. Our laughing and talking stopped when we all looked towards the street about 50 yards from the playground area we were at and saw 2 girls, roughly around the same age as us, jump over the fence and were walking towards the playground. They seemed like normal girls. They looked like they were smiling and talking amongst each other, though I couldn't hear anything from them. Normally, whenever we were at the school, it was only us that would be there, so we decided to leave at this point. We called our dog over and put her leash on and started walking towards the entrance of the school, our backs pointed towards the girls, leaving the playground and them to be alone. I looked back once and saw the girls had taken our spot on the jungle gym. Then we all stopped and turned to look together. In the exact same spot that I had just seen the girls sitting not 30 seconds prior were 2 crows. There's no way that the girls were fast enough to climb off the jungle gym, run about 50 yards to the fence, jump the fence without making a sound. We looked amongst each other with eyes wide open and ran off the school property and made our way back home. I'm not sure what this means or what it was, but it scared the shit out of all of us. Yeah, I don't blame you for being shit scared of this. This is a strange story. Really, really strange. So first of all, we've spoken about it before in the podcast. Somebody make a bingo card of phrases that I use all the time, because we've spoken about it before in the podcast would be well up there with phrases that I use on the reg. But schools, when they're empty, are fundamentally creepy places, right? Because a school is somewhere that's full of life, full of laughter, joy, movement, etc., etc. And then when it's empty and abandoned, it's like, oh, automatically already freaky. But I guess the reality is that this is not somewhere that you were expecting to see ghosts or spooky things, because this is somewhere where you guys played all the time and hung out together and made use of the facilities that were still there even though the place was abandoned. So it's not somewhere where you were primed and ready to see something spooky. And crows and ravens are often associated with spooky stuff, especially in folklore and tales of old. And whatever the explanation is for this story, I can't seem to quite find a rational explanation. So if it was just two little girls who had come to play in the playground, A, you said they didn't make any sound, they didn't make any noise, even though they appeared to be talking, so that's weird. And B, where did they go? Even if they had sprinted across the playground and tried to climb the fence and run out of view as quickly as possible, you would have seen them. And then, okay, they're two apparitions from when the school was a school. Interesting that they are appearing there like a stone tape theory type thing. So they're apparitions, they go to the jungle gym bit and then they disappear. And maybe the crows are just coincidental, or maybe they're shape-shifted into crows. Either way, it's scary as shit. And story number 2 comes from Stephanie. For a small backstory, I have always believed in the paranormal, from ghosts to angels, and will never disrespect the dead on purpose for any reason. I won't even stand on a grave, because I'm afraid of being haunted. Anyway, I work at night driving around all alone and just started listening and binging your podcast. I have 6 kids and my eldest daughter, who is 9, likes to ride with me, and she loves your podcast and has begged me to write in and tell you all the stories in my family. When I was little in the 90s, my dad always used to take us to a place called the Haunted Bridge. We would walk down the embankment and go swimming in the river for hours on end over the summer days. I'm in Alabama, so the summers are super hot and humid, and it was always fun and refreshing. I remember looking up underneath the bridge one day from swimming in the water and seeing a rope hanging there. Now, this is just a regular rope, right? Then why did I see an old black man hanging from the rope? I can still describe him in detail. He was wearing tattered overalls and his hair was about 6 inches high in an afro with a single grey streak in it. And if you looked at him long enough, then his eyes would start to go red. I didn't like the way he made me feel one bit. Fast forward years later, and my dad said he did not know if the bridge was actually haunted, because they used to just tell all the girls that, just to get them in their laps. So was I really seeing someone, or was it just my mind playing tricks on me because of being told it was haunted? When I was a teenager in the early 2000s, I went back to the haunted bridge with a boyfriend at around midnight. I wasn't scared. After all, my dad told me that they just told girls that, right? My boyfriend and I were really big into photography, and he loved the view of the river from up on top of the bridge with the moon shining down. So he ran back to the car to get his camera. He had been gone for a minute or two when someone walked behind me from my left shoulder to my right shoulder. I turned to tell him that was fast, only to be met by no one. I looked around, over to the car, and there he was, still getting his camera out of the back seat. I stood there frozen, waiting for him to come back, feeling my heart trying to jump through my throat. When he walked back, I told him what had happened, and we noped the hell out of there as fast as we could. My grandfather passed away in 2014. The only children I had at the time was just my eldest son, but my nephew was 4 at the time. For context, my grandmother called my dad in the middle of the night to come and help my grandfather up off the floor because he had fallen off the bed. We work nights, so it was no big deal. He went over there and it was around 4 a.m. He got my grandfather up onto the bed and was going to get him into the shower because we all planned to go out for breakfast that morning for Mother's Day. My grandfather stood up and slowly slunk down back into the floor, and my dad put his arms around him and tried to get him to stand back up. This was the point that my grandfather took one last breath and died in my dad's arms. The paramedics came, worked on my grandfather and started taking him to the hospital. As they walked out the door, they told my dad they were sorry. I got the call at around 8 a.m. confirming that my grandfather had passed away, on Mother's Day no less. We all went to the hospital to say our final goodbyes. My nephew walked into the room where my grandfather's body was and said that he could see my grandfather standing in the corner of the room. He said he was slightly younger and not hunched over like an old man, but it was definitely my grandfather. Fast forward 10 years and we have been living in his house for 1 year now. Since he has passed away, we have had dreams about him, smelled his pipe tobacco, and have heard him walking around the house. My nephew, now 14, has said that he has seen him standing at the end of the hallway and described in detail the clothes that he was wearing. My nephew would not be able to really remember him in detail because he was only 4 when he died. So I wholeheartedly believe that my grandfather is still here and is now making his presence known. We have randomly had the smoke detectors go off saying, "Evacuate, evacuate, smoke detected," when there is not smoke. We thought faulty batteries, but the detectors are wired into the house itself and the batteries are meant to be as a backup if the power goes out. I suppose it could be faulty wiring. But the house was just rebuilt after being burnt down by accident, totally separate event, and even as we speak the detectors are going off and I now believe it to be my grandfather, which gives me some comfort. Yet at the same time I have to remind him not to scare the shit out of me because I do scare easily. There have been so many little things in this house that I am sure he is here. My 1-year-old son was laughing and playing with someone by the front door. He was turning his head to the side as if playing peekaboo, and he was laughing and waving hi. I asked my eldest daughter who was standing there by the door because I knew my husband or eldest son was trying to scare me. And she said, "No one." I called her a liar and I got up to check. And sure enough, there was no one there. I just looked at my son and said, "You better stop being creepy. Tell him to go bye-bye." And all my daughter did was laugh. I would like to point out that today is July the 25th, 2024, so all of this activity is old and new. When my dad was 14, he was up at his grandparents' house staying the night. He was in their spare room when the bed started to randomly shake violently, and he noped the hell out of there, smoked 2 packets of cigarettes and refused to go back into the room for about 5 years. He has seen a cat go through the door and then into the floor, which he said was not nearly as scary as the bed shaking. In his adult years, as he was working, he has seen shadows move out of the corner of his eyes as well as I have. One story that sticks out was that he had a customer call my mom and ask her to tell my dad to please stop bothering him at around 3 a.m. outside his window because he was trying to sleep. My dad assured my mom that he wasn't doing anything. This customer's driveway was a long driveway, and then there was bushes that you would have to walk through to get to his bedroom window. My dad would not get out of his car, let alone go up to this guy's bedroom window at 3 a.m. and wake him up. My dad decided to find out what was going on, so on this particular night, he drove down the driveway and he shone his headlights on the bedroom window. And that is when he saw a little black figure that he could only describe as gnome-shaped and sized, jump down from the window and run off into the darkness. He never again went down that man's driveway. So when we did the story of the Public Monster a couple of weeks ago on the main episode, we talked about one of the bridges having a story about a black boy who was lynched and hung from the bridge, and that's why the bridge was haunted. And there was also other versions of the story where it wasn't a boy, it was a man, and it was actually his wife that was haunting the bridge. So there were, various different iterations of this story. And I think that stories like that are commonplace in, all corners of America. And I mean, we know that these stories really happened, which is absolutely horrendous to think about. But stories of hauntings that have sprung up because of things like this, things like lynchings and, the completely senseless and violent and brutal murder of Black people. So I wonder if a story like this exists about this bridge too. Whatever the case may be, what you saw sounds absolutely terrifying. And I'm sure that you've probably had these conversations in the years since, but I wonder, did anybody else in your cohort see this or experience this or see something similar? And to go back then years later and to experience that feeling of somebody walking behind you that's so palpable that you think it is actually your boyfriend, that is terrifying. And as for the story about your grandfather, we always say it, people find a way of coming back. And I think it's really interesting, the 4-year-old nephew in the situation coming in and being like, I see Granddad, but he looks younger, he's not as stooped over, he doesn't look as old. That's really fascinating. And I think it's a lovely thing to take comfort in, that this man is continuing to look out for you all those years later. But also very helpful to give a reminder of yeah, it's fine that you're here, but just don't scare the shit out of me, please. And just to round up on your dad's stories, the first one with the bed shaking, terrifying. Yeah, I'd be smoking 2 packs of cigarettes and not going back into the room again for 5 years too. But the story about the little gnome creature, shut up. Gnomes really scare me. Stories about little gnomes or I don't know, leprechaun type figures scare the shit out of me. They really do. And I always find it really interesting that all cultures pretty much all over the world have different versions of gnome stories and different versions of gnome type creatures. Oh, it's giving me the heebie-jeebies.
When you use SAP Concur Solutions to automate your business finances, you'll be ready for anything. Except when your train to work is also headed to the comic convention with the mighty Zorg on board, who happened to bump into his arch nemesis. With SAP Concur, you can be ready for almost anything. Take control of your business finances today at Concur.com.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
And story number 3 today comes from Tiffany. I recently listened to an episode where you told a story about a visitation dream, and I felt I had to share this since it impacted me so much and was the first paranormal experience I've had in years. It's also still fresh in my mind because this happened within the last 6 months or so. When I was 7, my parents divorced. It was ugly and brutal, and I had a front row seat for all the drama. And what I didn't see, my mother would fill me in with all of the dirty details. Wonderful parenting, I know. About 1.5 years later, my mother married the funniest and cuddliest man I'd ever known. Jeff was always cracking jokes, bringing home treats for my little sister and me, taking us camping, watching movies with us, or playing video games with us. The only problem was that he had a pretty bad temper. Never towards us, but my mother has a way of pushing people to their breaking point, and it never took him long to reach his. He always described her as a chihuahua that thinks it can take on a pit bull. She's always been very physical when it comes to arguments and fights. And while I never saw Jeff beat her up, I did see him push her or restrain her to basically protect himself. And with him being so much bigger than her, it was always pretty scary to see. Towards the end of their marriage, maybe 2 years in, my mother started telling me how when my sister and I weren't around, he would slap, punch and kick her, call her horrible names, and just physically and verbally destroy her. She would say how scared she was of Jeff and that she was planning a way for us to get away safely. As a 10-year-old, the more she told me, the more frightened of him I became, and I started to pull away from him. At that time, and for most of my life until now, my mother was my best friend, and I wholeheartedly believed every word that she said. The last time I saw Jeff, he and my mother were trying to straighten out some bills and their taxes. I went outside to play in the backyard, and after a while I started hearing screaming, yelling and banging. I ran inside to see my mother on the floor and Jeff standing over her, screaming at her. In my 10-year-old mind, that was proof to me that everything that she had said about him was true, even though there was never any bruises or evidence of abuse. Fast forward 26 years later. My mother texted me that she saw on Facebook that Jeff had passed away. This was someone that I hadn't seen or spoken to in nearly 30 years, and I had thought for all of those years that he was just a piece of shit human. But for some reason I became incredibly emotional, and all these wonderful memories of Jeff came flooding back. It was such an odd feeling. A few months later, some things came to light about my mother. She has always been a very controlling person, and I had actually begun to pull away from her little by little over the past few years because of how much she wanted to have when it came to my marriage and children. But the level of lying and manipulating that had been found out was enough to make me comfortable with going no contact. At first it felt amazing, like an elephant had been lifted off my shoulders to not have her in my day-to-day life anymore. But after about a month I really started struggling. I was so enmeshed with her that I started feeling like I couldn't do anything without her. For about a week I would cry daily. One night I cried myself to sleep, and I went somewhere in my dreams that was very different than anything I'd seen in my dreams before. It's hard to describe now, but the place was very comforting and peaceful. I heard a voice behind me, and when I turned to look, it was Jeff. He was still a big burly man, I remembered, and he just scooped me up into a hug like I was a little kid again. I could feel the hair from his beard on top of my head, and I could literally smell the Old Spice he used back then. The next thing I knew, we were sinking down into the old lazy boy recliner he had, where my sister and I would cuddle up with him to watch TV. We sat there for the longest time, just holding each other, and I began to cry. He turned my face towards him and said, "It's all going to be okay, I promise." When I woke up, I could still smell the Old Spice, and I just burst into tears. But they weren't sad tears like I'd been crying for weeks, they were tears of relief. Again, it felt like another huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It started to hit me after nearly 30 years of lies that Jeff didn't actually do any of the things she'd accused him of doing. While he did have a bad temper and probably should have gotten help for his short fuse, he wasn't the abusive son of a bitch my mother made him out to be. It was actually her that was just the piece of shit human all along. But of all the family members and friends I've had pass away, he was the last person I ever thought would come back to visit me. But I'm so thankful that he did. I'm so thankful that he did too, for your sake, because if nothing else, it also gives, a sense of closure. And I do think that that's the important thing with visitation dreams, is that they can give people such a sense of peace and calm and closure. And every so often I'll have people that message me and say, "I don't know why you do dream stories, they're just dreams, there's nothing paranormal about them at all, etc., etc." And that's, that's a totally legitimate point of view to have. But I always think that if it gives people closure and it makes people feel better and it makes people feel calmer and makes people feel less distraught about loss, then actually maybe it's okay to read them out, and maybe it's okay to just enjoy them for what they are, even if you don't believe that they're paranormal. And in this instance, I feel like it gives a sort of different sense of closure, that it's not necessarily about, that you were mourning the loss of Jeff for those 30 years or however long it was, but that it gave you a different perspective on your life and on situations in your life with your mum and with Jeff and with other aspects of your relationship with your mum. And I'm not going to comment too much on your relationship with your mum, because obviously it's your relationship with your mum and she sounds like a very complex individual. But I will say that, fuck me, relationships with parents can be incredibly difficult. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you hear any discrepancies in the audio today, it is because I am currently in Ireland and I just had to move recording location mid-record because somebody started trimming hedges outside of the house. So I apologise if you can hear any audio discrepancies. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you so much to Charmane, Stephanie and Tiffany for sending in your stories. Remember, the last story came from the 25th of July 2024. And if you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Discover Hydro, the best kept secret in fitness. Hydro is the state-of-the-art at-home rower that engages 86% of your muscles, delivering the ultimate full-body workout in just 20 minutes. From advanced to beginner, Hydro has over 500 classes, shot worldwide and taught by Olympians and world-class athletes. For a 30-day risk-free trial, go to hydro.com and use code ROW450 to save $450 on a Hydro Pro rower. That's HYDROW.com, code ROW450.